Welcome back to another episode of the Top Attorneys of North America podcast. Today's episode is a great one, as our guest is a powerhouse at the intersection of law, human resources, and organizational strategy. Natalie Holder, an employment attorney with an SPHR certification, Senior Professional in Human Resources. She is licensed in New York and Connecticut. She is an award-winning speaker and a leadership strategist who has advised some of the most complex institutions in the country, from Stanford University to the U.S. Capitol Police. Natalie is also the author of the acclaimed book, Exclusion: Strategies for Improving Diversity in Recruitment, Retention, and Promotion, where she delivers practical, evidence-based solutions to one of the most pressing challenges in today's workplace: building truly inclusive, high-performing organizations. With experience delivering high-stakes compliance training for organizations like Fox News and the New York City Fire Department, Natalie brings a rare blend of legal insight and real-world execution. And on top of all that, she's a fellow Long Islander just like myself. Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sal. It's good to be here.
I'm excited to have you on as well. I have to start here. Most pressing questions first, ones that matter the most to Long Island residents. Where do you stand? Jones Beach, Robert Moses, or are you going North Shore for a quieter vibe?
So I'm from Long Island, and I'm like smack in the middle of North Shore and South Shore. And so my family always did Jones Beach. And when I got older, I could drive and I could explore Long Island for myself. I'll admit, I was an Oyster Bay girl.
Ah,
Yeah,
the oyster,
I enjoyed
the,
going there.
the
Yeah,
Oyster
I enjoyed
Fest.
going up to the shore at Oyster Bay. And then recently, I have a friend who lives on the South Shore. He's over in, I want to say like Oceanside.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to say Oceanside. And the whole like South Shore shoreline has been beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful. There's a boardwalk out there. I want to say it's Lido Beach,
Yeah, you're on Long Beach now.
Long Beach.
Yep.
And I'll admit, the South Shore calls my name.
Excellent. And be honest, once you leave Long Island, is it basically impossible to find a proper bagel or a slice of pizza?
So this is going to break your heart. But
Oh,
yes, I lived in New Haven, Connecticut for a number of years, and it pained my heart to admit that New Haven had some of the best pizza that I've ever tasted. Yeah, I mean, the regular pizza shop that I grew up with was on, either Post Avenue or Jericho Turnpike. However, when I moved to New Haven, they have an area called Wooster Square,
okay.
and it's nothing but it's like a little Italy. It's nothing but Italian pastries and pizza and Italian food, and they've perfected it.
Oh,
Yeah.
it does break my heart to hear that. but, but perfect. Now that we have that out of the way, uh, take us back. What inspired you, or how did you first enter the legal services industry, and what drew you specifically toward employment law?
Now, I'd love to tell you that there was some very, you know, uh, academic reason as to why I decided to go into law. I'd love to tell you that the story was, based in something that was, so significant in history, but it was really just that I was in Europe. um, I was backpacking through Europe, and I had actually won some money when I was in college. I was a work study student, and I had this advisor who really admired my work ethic. Interestingly enough, I didn't think that she and I got along, but she watched what I was doing and she admired what I was doing and she put my name in for this scholarship. And I actually won it. And it was unrestricted funds. I could do whatever I wanted with it. And while my family thought, oh, do something intelligent with it, something that is hardworking, why don't you buy a computer and a printer? And I said, no, I'm going to spend this money by traveling to Europe, someplace I've never been to before. And so I spent about 3 to 4 months just traveling all throughout Europe. And when I was in the south of France, I ran into these two Harvard graduates who, pulled me aside and said, hey, have you thought about SEO? And I thought, what's that? And this was before the internet, right?
Mm-hmm.
He said, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity has like these different programs that students can pursue as they're figuring out where do they want to land professionally. And they have a corporate law track, they have a finance track. You should really consider this. And I thought, why not? It's an opportunity to like really test this thing out. And so I applied to SEO. I was chosen as one of the only two juniors out of 1,000 applicants to be in their summer program. And it really changed the trajectory of my life. I was placed at Debevoise and Plimpton, which is an Am Law 100 law firm in New York City and has offices all over the world. And it was fascinating to watch how these attorneys, it's a whole different life, that there was no such thing as like a lunch break necessarily. Growing up, my parents had very 9 to 5 type jobs. This was the first time that I'd been in an environment where you stayed until the work really got done. And it was an environment where you were exposed to so many unique areas of the law because this was a very sophisticated firm. And so I thought, I actually enjoy this. Let me see what law school would look like. And who knew? About a year later, I applied to Tulane Law School, and the rest is history.
Oh, that's perfect. So backpacking through Europe was serendipitous and led you to where you are today.
Times in life, I find that it is the serendipitous that shapes our trajectories in ways that we could have never imagined. Once again, I'd love to say that I was the person who, designed this great career. But oftentimes I'm put into spaces and places that I could have never imagined. And I just go with it sometimes. And so this was when I really, I thank those guys from Harvard, kept in touch with one of them for years. In fact, it was interesting. The law firm that I wound up going to actually worked with him in a private matter. So, the legal profession sometimes can feel very tight knit. And it's great when you run into people who you've worked with and who you enjoyed being around.
Yes. Now, I know that you're both an attorney and a senior professional in human resources. How does that dual perspective give you an edge when advising organizations?
Being the employment attorney, having that hat really helps me understand the why behind the policies and the procedures, because I've seen what happens in the litigation space when you don't have these practices, policies, and procedures. There's a reason why we need the code of conduct. There's a reason why we need people to not just sign off on the training, but to actually take the training. In other words, we don't just want people looking at the guidebooks and saying, oh, they received our handbook on employee conduct. We want people to actually sit in the sessions and really absorb what we're trying to share with them so that when there is litigation further on down the road, we can honestly say we trained our people. These people had notice of what their rights and responsibilities were. Now, the SPHR hat, that's really the hat that looks at performance and the performance of people in the organization. I often say that, if you have an organization and you employ people, you really still do need to have some semblance of understanding how to interact with people and how to really guide them to their best performance. And so it's a complement of each other because I talk about and I understand how to craft the policies, how to build them, how to draft them. But it's the SPHR piece that also helps with understanding how do we make sure that we have a workforce that really can meet organizational demands. So it's not just providing the laws and the governance of the organization. It's also making sure that there's a people aspect to it.
And now that led to your book Exclusion, which tackles workplace diversity in a very practical way. What inspired you to write the book, and what's one key takeaway every leader should understand?
Once again, serendipity, Sal, right? So
Yeah.
I was a very active member of the New York City Bar Association when I practiced. Uh, you know, Big shout out to bar associations. If you're an attorney, I highly recommend that you get involved, because that's how you meet people. That's how you network with people within your profession. And they were looking for someone to go to Auckland, New Zealand to give a presentation on, the state of employment law. And they wanted it from a public sector perspective. And I thought, I can handle that. At the time, I was an attorney for the New York City, Human Rights Commission. How much more public sector can you get than that? And so I thought, well, I could always talk about the cases that I'm handling, the complaints that I'm receiving, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. I said, I want to get to a space where people not only understand what are the trends that are happening in our workplaces today, but I'd really go one step further into helping people understand how and why, when you're talking about a topic like diversity, you need to have all different voices at the table. So back when I originally wrote, my first book, diversity to me was quite understood. It was quite misunderstood. The thought was diversity really was the domain of people who were historically underrepresented in organizations. So it's your it's your racial minorities, people who find themselves in the minority based on race, gender, disability, age, and so on. And I found that oftentimes, because of the way these, programs were positioned, the language that was used, it really felt like an us versus them dynamic. And I said, there's no way that you can really create a cohesive workplace when you have people who are pit against each other. You can't really have a cohesive effort if people don't see themselves as a part of it. And so I decided to step back from just looking at the complaints I was receiving. And I said, well, what does it look like? What's one universal experience that all of us have? Or I would say the majority of us have. And if we haven't had the experience, we know somebody who has. And it was the experience of being an outsider. At the end of the day, that's what discrimination and harassment is all about. It's, being treated like an outsider. And so I wanted to tap into that experience. And so I started interviewing people, and I just had, very thin criteria. I wanted to make sure that people had, were gainfully employed. I wanted to make sure that people had achieved a certain level of success. I spoke to people who are junior level and senior level, but I wanted to make sure that I was talking to people who ostensibly could be considered professionals. And I asked them that simple question, and their answers took me in so many different directions. But I found that there was this consistent pattern that was coming up, over and over again, in where people's responses started to fall into these very distinct buckets. Whether it was they felt that they were not given access to informal mentoring, whether it was that they felt that they were perceived to be an underperformer, whether it was that they felt the pressure of having a dual identity. In other words, having, not being accepted for who you are in the organization and having to pretend and basically, assimilate to the organization just to be included in what the organization, in the organizational fabric. And so I started to develop this theory that, based on what I was hearing about these 10 different buckets of what people were experiencing, when people encountered them, they oftentimes felt as though they were pushed away or excluded from the inner workings of their organization. And so they then figured out, all right, am I going to pivot? Am I going to stay? And what leverage do I have? And what strategies am I going to use in this space? And so I thought this is something that could be useful for employers who are trying to figure out how and why they're losing their best people. And for employees who are trying to figure out, is it me? And if it isn't me, well, how do I navigate this workplace?
And I am glad that you did bring up the word diversity, um, inclusion, and I do feel that many people do have misconceptions about it still to this day. Can you please properly explain DEI for our listeners, especially or particularly the idea that DEI initiatives encourage hiring unqualified candidates?
Diversity, equity, inclusion, just by its name, diversity means looking at how and where your organization may have opportunities to go after talent that you don't currently have. Diversity really is just bringing in demographic and cognitive differences into your organization. I don't know too many areas of life and where diversity is not welcomed. When you think about your Sal, when you think about your stock portfolio,
Mm-hmm.
are you only stuck in one, asset class? Most likely not. The whole idea is you diversify your portfolio so that when you have wins in certain areas, they can, make up for the losses you may have in other areas. And that's like the puzzling pieces of diversity and that what it can bring to an organization. There are all these studies about the business case and what it means to have, more people from different backgrounds and how it creates different financial gains for an organization. That's all well and good. However, I'm really more interested in what what are the opportunities that are available that an organization can really take advantage of if they were to start looking beyond what are the usual suspects or who are the usual suspects in their organization and really figure out how do they embrace people from different backgrounds to add to the richness of the organization. When you think about equity, I look at equity as how do you create a level playing field? How do you create policies and practices that are even handed? I can't tell you how many times when I was a chief diversity officer, I'd get these phone calls from men who were looking for more equitable practices when it came to caregiving. Because during the pandemic, and I would say as we were getting out of the pandemic, many of these male caregivers, they were now tasked with being much more involved with dropping the kids off at school, picking them up. And they weren't looking for special treatment in the workplace. They were just looking for something more equitable, like, can we start the meeting at 10 o'clock in the morning versus 9 o'clock in the morning? We'll still have the meeting. It's just adjusting the time so that we can all participate at a level in where we can all be available and truly engaged and present for the meeting. When I think about inclusion, inclusion is that concept, it is that cornerstone piece of thinking about what does it mean to be invited to the organization. So they hired you, but are they really using your genius? There's nothing worse than being hired for your genius, but then being sidelined and not being listened to, not having your thoughts and ideas and concepts acknowledged or even accepted as a contribution to the organization, or even worse, having your ideas stolen and never getting, credited for what you brought to the organization. So on a basic level, that is how I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And diversity, equity, inclusion, when you're thinking about the essence of it, is not in contradiction to merit. It's not in contradiction to equal employment practices. Quite honestly, it's what makes equal employment processes and practices possible. And so that's how I look at the work.
Excellent. And in listening to you, it's evident, and I know why you've delivered compliance training in many high pressure environments. New York City Fire Department, Fox News. What's different about training in those settings versus, let's say, a typical corporate audience?
When I've been brought in to deliver, consent decree order training, that is training that comes as a result of a lawsuit, a discrimination, harassment, even a retaliation claim by an employee. And the employer and the employee have reached a settlement. However, for that settlement to be okayed by the judge, a federal judge, the judge wants to see that there's been some training. They want to see that remedial measures have been taking place in the organization. And so that's how I'm pulled in. And so, as you can probably imagine, in an organization where people know that there was a lawsuit, people know that I'm there as a result of a lawsuit, many times there's skepticism. Is the organization really going to change its colors? Are things really going to get better? And I've often advised people during my sessions to take what I'm saying and to apply it to their lives, that this is an opportunity for them to help the organization right the ship. This is an organization to provide feedback. One thing I always say during my sessions is use your human resources department, use your internal complaint mechanisms to the extent that you possibly can, because smart organizations would much rather have a million complaints that are taking place internally as opposed to having that one lawsuit that's filed, as opposed to having that one complaint that's filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that one regulatory complaint with the Department of Labor. And so even though there might be skepticism, I do assure people that I'm there to help them understand how to navigate their workplaces, how to create more cohesion, how to make sure that there's more fairness and equity in their organizations, and how and where and when to really take advantage of their internal complaint mechanisms. And hopefully the organization, has a really good investigations mechanism to make sure that, once again, something is done with the complaint. Now, if I'm going into an organization that has self-selected and said, this is a priority for us, we don't have a lawsuit hanging over our heads. This is something that we've determined is important for us in terms of the values that we hold, in terms of making sure that people feel safe in our workplaces. It's a very different sentiment. I do find that it's a little bit more interactive. I find that it's also not so much thinking about just the do's and don'ts, because that's a lot of the questions you get in compliance training, the do's and don'ts. But if I'm delivering a training that might be compliance-based, but I weave in the culture element, I weave in the components of what does it take to build a strong organizational environment, that's where I find that people are really more creative, and they're a little bit more vulnerable and open to figuring out, how do I make sure that the people working with me understand what motivates me? And how do I make sure that that's a part of how we move forward in this organization with building products, innovation, and offerings to our customers and clients?
A lot of organizations talk about DEI, but struggle to implement it effectively. And I really want to know what separates organizations that succeed from those that, like you said, just check the box.
I'll admit, I was somewhat of a contrarian in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space when I first started this work back in, I would say, the early 2000s. So diversity work has been around for over 30 years. I got into it about maybe 25 years ago, and I would oftentimes get into clashes with some of my colleagues who were trying to do the right thing. They had the right goals, but it was how they were going about it that I had the issue. As an employment lawyer, my foundation is based on Title VII and laws that say that you have to treat people fairly. You have to provide equal opportunities to people, regardless of their race, color, gender, national origin, and all other characteristics that are immutable to us. I would find myself sitting in meetings with people who were putting together these diversity receptions. And the diversity reception, because the thought was we want to create a space for attorneys who are diverse. And in a moment, I'll even pick a bone with that term. What does it mean to be the diverse person, right? Like, who's not the diverse person? I think a lot of the language that has been used around diversity, equity, inclusion was problematic and brought us to where we are today, where there's this huge backlash against this work. But once again, getting back to where I was sitting in these meetings where people were putting together programs like a diversity reception, and they only wanted to, invite the diverse attorneys, and they would explicitly exclude white men. And I thought, I can't be a part of this, because even though I understand that your goal is to create a space in where attorneys that find themselves in the minority in their law firms, I want to say that African Americans make up less than 6% of law firm partners within AmLaw law firms. Women, other people of color, similarly make up very small pockets of, equity partners within these firms. We haven't reached parity. And I understand the desire to create a space for these professionals to coalesce and to be in an environment where they can let their hair down and have the conversations that they might not feel comfortable having in other spaces. However, if I'm a part of an organization that is open to all, if I'm a part of an organization that is a public accommodation organization, I don't believe that you can go about having a diversity reception by explicitly stating that you don't want a particular population to participate, all because of their gender and their race. Quite honestly, I said that is what would make me quite upset if I knew that I was excluded. So I'm always that person who, I understand where the motivations are, but I also stop and think about, if I were on the receiving end of a communication that said, oh, well, we want to have a diversity reception and not include Black women, how would I feel? And so that's how I went about it. That's how I look at the work. And so I'll admit, toward the end of 2024, 2020, early part of 2025, I started to create this distinction in the DEI space in terms of looking at who were like true diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners versus people who were thrust into these environments, thrust into these roles without the proper training, education, and experience. I found that the people who were the latter, the people who didn't really have a firm foundation in terms of understanding our employment laws, understanding even HR practices and HR practices around equality and equity, I found that they were, the people who were creating these wholesale initiatives that oftentimes did exclude different pockets of their organization. And as a result, those people who have felt sidelined, marginalized, even at times offended. I'll admit, when I looked at some of the language that was used to describe certain programs, I thought, gosh, it just feels so ugly. I understand, once again, the motivation, but it's how it lands. And as we all know, many times it's not your intent that matters, it's your impact. And so I will say one thing that is a positive about the backlash that we're experiencing today. I mean, I'm sure that all of your listeners have read the newspapers and have seen that there's this repeal of diversity, equity, inclusion within our federal government and within a number of different states. I have found that the organizations that really were engaged in true diversity, equity, inclusion work, that had the right practitioners at the table, they are definitely moving forward with this work and getting even more intensive with it. That there really has been like a course correction in where DEI was this very amorphous concept, in where it was sometimes seen as social justice, and where sometimes it was seen as the nice thing to do for the organization. It was seen as like a social event for the organization. But the organizations that really had their finger on the pulse of understanding that DEI was a way of making sure that you're creating new markets and access for customers and clients, that you're actually creating a workplace environment in where everyone truly feels as though they're welcome, as though they belong, as though they can truly contribute. Because Sal, if you don't believe that you can contribute to the organization, you're not going to. You're not going to come up with the next major invention for your organization. And if you do create it, you leave that organization, you get some VC funding, and you create it on your own. And so the organizations that really were doing the great work, I would say all along, those are organizations that are still moving forward. I know that there are political leaders that like to think that they've gotten rid of DEI.
Mm.
I don't want to tell any tales out of school, but
Well,
let's just say I know hundreds of organizations that are forging through with this work because they have seen the massive benefits it brings not only to their people, but also to their customers and clients.
understood, understood. And I would like to touch on something that you said. Yes, DEI, the backlash that we're seeing, it obviously has been a polarizing topic as of late. And I would like to state that I have watched many clips of Charlie Kirk, who's a very controversial figure. Now, there's no room for violence in this world, and nobody deserves to be murdered over words, no matter what your stance is on a topic. That being said, he was known for stirring debate through his comments, and one thing that really sticks out in my mind is one of his comments where he said, if I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, I hope he's qualified. Now, in all fairness, in a subsequent interview, he later clarified and tried to walk back his statements a little and said that it does not reflect his beliefs, but he attributed that his comment was towards democratic DEI programs. And he also stated that DEI invites unwholesome thinking. With what you just said, with recent federal actions scaling back DEI programs, yes, you're still seeing a core group of companies moving forward with it. How do you see this shift impacting your work and the advice you provide to organizations? And most importantly, how do you address the perception that DEI invites unwholesome or biased thinking?
Yeah, DEI done right cannot invite bias or unwholesome thinking. Because when you are thinking about the organization, when you're thinking about how to move forward with practices and policies and procedures that really are creating a level playing field for everyone in your organization, and you have mechanisms to make sure that people can provide feedback and commentary, and then ultimately making sure that you're not just simply hiring from the same pool of people that you normally go to, that you're not just simply going to your favorite, your favorite meeting and hoping that that meeting is able to get you the people who you need to join your organization. But now you're really starting to expand where you're looking for talent. That kind of work, it doesn't generate unwholesome thinking. Once again, I agree with you that with Charlie Kirk, it was a tragedy. And, my sympathies and condolences go out to his family. But here's what I think, quite honestly. You talk about polarizing. I never even heard of Charlie Kirk before his death. That's how much of an echo chamber, quite honestly, that we live in right now as a society, in where I'll admit, I'm so surrounded, and this is something I'll admit I've been working on. I've been working on getting out of my echo chamber. Quite honestly, every now and then someone pulls me out of it and makes me realize not everybody believes in the whole concept of, or the wholesale concept of equality. Not everyone has gotten to a place where they're no longer using racial epithets and slurs to refer to people. It still exists. It was interesting. I was looking at this statement the other day, a really pithy post on LinkedIn where someone was, looking at or had posted a picture of people who were protesting against children who are being integrated into Southern schools, and just the anger and the fervor that people had brought to these children who were just there to get an education. Person said, these people are grown up now. These people have children, and you better believe that they have passed along their hatred, their beliefs to their children. Now, we like to believe that we all have choices, that we can make our own choices once we, reach an age of majority. However, those seeds were planted. And so it's important to remember that those seeds have been planted in this country. And I think that sometimes we like to believe that it is unwholesome to tell the truth about this country, that we have a country that was built on hateful ideologies at times, that we are a country that was built on not seeing people as people, but instead as fractions of people. That is our history. Now, it doesn't mean that we cannot learn from it. And to me, I think the richest of our country is that we do have the opportunity to learn from it, that we do have the opportunity to move on. Yeah. However, many of Charlie Kirk's statements, even though he may try to backtrack, he made a lot of statements and didn't backtrack on them. Calling, the Civil Rights Act, something that he didn't believe should have happened. And let's just be real about what the Civil Rights Act was. The Civil Rights Act made it possible to have fairness and equality in employment, public accommodations, voting. These are the fundamental freedoms in our country that the Civil Rights Act finally bestowed upon all Americans. Without the Civil Rights Act, you wouldn't have Andrea Lucas, who is the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity, giving and creating and posting a commercial inviting white men to file charges of discrimination and harassment and retaliation with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Civil Rights Act created the EEOC. And also, let's just be real. DEI never took away the rights of any group to file a complaint of discrimination or harassment. Even going back to, when the term reverse discrimination was first touted, I would cringe and think, well, if this is reverse discrimination, then what are we saying about discrimination at whole? And white men actually, won some very significant cases of quote unquote reverse discrimination well before this administration. So I believe that right now there is this social dominance theory that is being masqueraded as merit. That's being masqueraded as, we're looking to undo the harms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Were there some harms? Absolutely. Were there some trainings that were a bit misplaced, misnamed, didn't have the proper and thorough analysis of it? See, that's where good employment lawyers and HR work together, right? To make sure that you really are sussing out what truly needs to be a part of a training and education in order for it to stick and in order for it to be legal. But to say that all of DEI was harmful means that you don't understand the work.
Yeah. And frankly, it blows my mind that this hate still exists in the world today. It really is. It's disheartening. And in doing research in preparation of this interview, I noticed that even you are not immune to this ugliness. I was scrolling through your LinkedIn feed. I saw your post where you stated a couple of weeks ago that an unsavory individual hacked into your webinar and scribbled a racial epithet on your slide deck. Now, as a testament to your professionalism, you were able to turn that moment into a practical lesson, highlighting how this kind of ugliness can invade our workspaces without warning. My question, how do you personally navigate these moments of hate and ugliness, and what advice do you give to others facing similar challenges?
Webinar that I was hosting, it was a free webinar that I was doing in service to the thousands of people in this country right now who are unemployed, who are underemployed, and have decided that they want to or need to start their own businesses. And my goal and hope for these people is that they thrive. And the goal for me was to make sure that they don't lose their dream, all because they may have made a misstep with an employment law. Oftentimes, entrepreneurs are so focused on their zone of genius, which they should be, that they don't understand what's the difference between an employee and a contractor. They may not realize when they may have been withholding wages from someone. They might not have realized that someone was owed overtime. They may not realize that they have someone on their team who's creating a hostile work environment for other people. And so I wanted to make sure that entrepreneurs and the thousands of people who have been displaced by the federal government, the 600,000 plus Black women who are pushed out of organizations and have been unable to find new employment, making sure that all of these groups of people had access to, quality employment law highlights, that it was educational, couldn't provide, legal assistance, and can't provide advice as an attorney, but I could provide educational content around our employment laws. And I was in the middle of introducing myself to the people who had joined on to this seminar. And it was a good number of people who'd signed on. And all of a sudden, I noticed that someone was just like scrawling in red ink on my slide. And I thought, I don't remember doing this, and I'm not a tech person. So here I am just trying to figure out, well, what happened? And then the person didn't go from just doodling. They actually wrote the word slave. And once I saw that, and actually one of the attendees said, I think someone's trying to send you a message, I realized I need to shut this session down, because now I'm creating a potentially hostile work environment, or a hostile environment, not a work environment, but a hostile environment for anyone who's now sitting on this session. And so I informed everyone, okay, everyone shut down, log back in, and I'm going to one by one let everyone back into the room. And so I must admit, was probably one of the first times in my life where I've been confronted with such blatant discrimination and the exposure of a racial epithet. I know, Sal, you're thinking, but you grew up on Long Island. What are you talking about? Long Island, which is a very conservative place. And when my family moved to Long Island, we were the first and only family of color on our block. But I'll tell you, within the next 7 years, we were not the only. There were no other families who were the originals who were still living on our block. Everybody left. Everyone moved out. And so that's how I often saw disparate treatment. It was very subtle on Long Island. You were told, oh, let's interview you for this role. And you signed up, online, and you presented for the interview in person, and you'd be told, oh, the job no longer exists. That's how I encountered disparate treatment growing up in Long Island. However, something so blatant and so ugly was rare. And so what I tell people and what I tell employers is that once you have even a whiff of this existing in your organization, you've got to do exactly what I did physically with my computer. You got to shut it down. You've really got to shut down the hostile work environment, because even though as an employer, you might say, oh, I just thought it was a dispute amongst adults. That's not how the EEOC or a court is going to see this. And so you have to make sure that when people complain to you and they bring concerns to you, that you do something about it. That when someone actually complains about disparate treatment, you engage in an investigation. If you can't do it, hire a firm to do it for you. My firm does investigations. You want to make sure that you have someone, or you have some kind of mechanism to handle the concerns that come across your desk. Because if you don't, they will spiral. And in an environment now where so much gets posted on social media, a few weeks ago, we read about the founder of Noma, the restaurant Noma, the chief chef, Resnick, the way in which he reads, the social media around this person used to be about how great of a chef he was. If you search for his name right now, you will read about the physical and psychological abuse that he subjected his people to, punching his cooks, his sous chefs in the stomach, So, having a circle of shame and guilt to make people feel minimized. When you become aware of instances like that in the workplace, and that was really egregious, but when you become aware that you have an unsavory character on your team who might not be engaging in unlawful discrimination, but might be creating the kind of organizational environment that you don't want, even if that's your top seller, even if that's your top performer, you've got to nip it in the bud.
Mm, craziness. It does blow my mind, listening to what you said. And yeah, of course, you came from Long Island, and I don't know, maybe I'm naive in that fact that I don't believe in that type of talk. I don't believe in that type of hate. But I would like to go back to something you said earlier, that sometimes you're invited by companies, or you go to companies because there was lawsuits. And you mentioned identifying culture failures before they become lawsuits. What's one proactive step companies can take today to avoid tomorrow's legal issues?
I recommend having a process in terms of making sure that when your employees come to you, you have a way of responding to them. It's so important to listen, Sal. That's where so many of these issues, quite honestly, get won or lost. It's, as the supervisor, as the leader, are you listening to your people? And when you are listening to your people, are you doing something with the information that you've gathered? I joke about how companies will spend so much money on these Gallup surveys and where they want to do culture climate surveys. And I think to myself, half the time they could save so much money if they actually did something with those surveys. So many times companies will just do a survey, every 5 years, or, at whatever interval, and they'll take a look at it initially, pat themselves on the back, or say, we've got to work harder, and they shelve the reports. They don't do anything with them. On a more local level, your person A in the organization comes to you with a concern, a complaint, or an idea. And as a busy leader, you don't have the time or the space for it. And so a practical piece of advice is you've got to build in some way to make sure that you're listening to your people. You might not be able to implement everything, but you have to at least let people know that they've been listened to. Because until people have been listened to, they're never going to, until people feel as though they've been heard, they're not going to listen to you. And so I do believe that it's so important to make sure that, number one, that you're listening, but then number two, you have a mechanism for doing something with what you've heard.
I think there's hope, though. I look at my kids. My youngest is 14, and I don't observe any of the hate. I don't see that younger generation with those types of thoughts. Or maybe, I don't know if that's universal throughout the country, but looking ahead, how do you see workplace culture and employment law evolving over the next 3 to 5 years? Out with the old, in with the new. I mean, I personally, I see it improving.
Bella, I'm actually going to touch upon that last point that you made around looking at your children and using that as a benchmark for, how we're seeing ourselves as an evolving society. I too would like to imagine that my child and his friends, when I think about the school that my son goes to, they actually have celebrations for Persian New Year, which is called Nowruz. They have Eid celebrations. The school is closed. The whole school system is closed for Chinese New Year. The whole idea that there is now this acknowledgement of different cultures, that they're a part of our society. I'd like to believe that is a part of, or that's evidence that we are becoming much more evolved and expansive in our thinking. However, going back to the example that you brought up with Charlie Kirk, Charlie Kirk was a young man who was very popular and incredibly magnetic to college age students and high schoolers. And so what really, I'll admit, what opens my eyes and what gives me hope is that you do have this acknowledgement of different cultures and the whole idea that inclusion is a value that more and more people are embracing. However, what also scares me is that you do have this very, anti-equity, this very pro-social dominance theory element in young people, particularly young men in our country that are truly galvanized. And so I think it's important that we continue to understand that this work has to evolve, that the work of diversity, equity, inclusion might have to be called something different. We have to reframe it, rename it, and reposition it. But we can't give up the idea that there are still going to be marginalized populations, that there are still going to be people who try to marginalize. One of my top 10 indicators of a broken workplace culture, it's looking at managing bullies. The people I interviewed, boom, the whole idea that they were dealing with people who were either physically or psychologically trying to find ways to marginalize them. That's the work we have to continue with. But you did ask a more fun question around what do I see in terms of, the future. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention AI, right? AI is everywhere. And it's going to be very fascinating to see what AI does to our organizational cultures. So what used to take me, and once again, I'm not tech savvy, but what used to take me hours to create, putting together a PowerPoint deck for a meeting used to take me like a good 3-4 hours. I now go into Gamma, or I actually created my own app. And I can go in there and I can tinker for a few minutes, put in my prompt, and voila, in an hour, I can tinker with it and I've got a very polished and professional work product. What will that look like in the workplace where we're able to get more done in less time? Will it now mean that leaders will start spending more time with their people and really start providing the informal mentoring that makes the difference in whether someone is meeting expectations, exceeding expectations, or is nowhere even on the charts? Will this mean that we will start adding even more work and expectations? So I don't know about you, Sal, but so many people are wedded to their cell phones on the weekends. Even on vacation, they're still checking emails. I wonder if we're going to take advantage of AI to the extent that we can start doing more in less time and start taking more time for ourselves, for our sanity, for our families? Or are we now going to start adding more to our workload? Those are some of the items I'm curious about. But then immediately what we're starting to see with AI is that human resource professionals are seeing complaints come from employees that look like they were drafted by lawyers. AI has been incredible with coaching people and giving people the language to state their concerns in a legalistic way. And so what will be interesting will be how human resource departments and legal departments will have to engage with their people who will know a little bit more about their rights than they used to.
Yeah, excellent. I didn't even think pearls of wisdom there. That's a whole topic and an hour in itself. Obviously, I mean, your work deals with high stake issues. I know that. On a personal level, what do you do to decompress and recharge outside of work?
Now, Sal, that's the hardest question you've asked so far. So admittedly, I moved out of the city just so that I could, on an everyday basis, feel as though I can decompress just from a visual, So after leaving Long Island, I went to New York University and I fell in love with living in cities. And so for the next, 25, 30 years, I lived in places where I shared a wall with people, whether I was in the Village in Manhattan or in New Haven, Connecticut, or Stanford, Connecticut. I shared a wall with someone. And I finally decided a few years ago, no longer. So I now live on like 2 acres of land in where it really is just like peaceful greenery, because that is what physically will feed my soul. Being able to touch grass, being able to run my fingers through, my cherry blossoms when they actually bloom. That is what brings me peace. I'm also a bit of the typical nerd where I like to read on the weekends. I like to go on vacations, and I actually do go on vacations. I am not checking email or talking to anyone about anything business oriented when I'm on vacation with my family, because that's a priority for me.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm on the South Shore of Long Island, and you're right. I mean, just having access to the beautiful waterways, access to the boardwalks, nothing nothing can beat that. That's my acreage. And I would like to ask, at the end of the day, what kind of impact do you hope your work leaves on organizations and the people within them?
I hope that after I've worked with an organization, that there is a feeling of we have a better understanding of what our people need, and that employees can say, I have a better understanding of the challenges my leader is facing. That's that bridge that I always like to create in order to lessen the divide. Oftentimes, leaders will always say, oh, I want more performance out of my people. I want to have people who are more engaged. But if they're building those initiatives on the pixie dust of, remember those dandelion blowaways?
Yeah.
Exactly. Remember those?
Yes.
That's what all of that is. The dandelion fluff, that's what all of those performance mechanisms, that's what it all is. Unless you have a firm foundation of truly being even-handed, having a level playing field, really giving people a sense that they've got a fair shot in the organization. If people don't have that, you can invest all the money you want in retention programs and performance management, all of it. It's all for naught. On the other side of the spectrum, I also want people to feel as though they understand what their leaders are looking for. They understand how to better connect with their colleagues. They understand how to better communicate their concerns and their thoughts, and that they truly do believe that their organizations will address whatever is being brought to them. Now, have I worked with organizations where, after I've done the training and I've suggested additional work, I've realized, oh, this was really just to check the box. Got it. But for the organization where I make other recommendations and they're open and they say, okay, yeah, let's go a step further with this, I feel as though there's a genuine interest. And that's what I really appreciate.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And for our listeners interested in booking you for speaking presentations or wanting to reach out, what's the best way to do so? Is there a specific website, phone number, email?
Well, thank you, Sal. So if anyone wants to, well, first off, Sal, thank you so much for having me on your show.
Oh,
And if people were interested in just connecting with me, just to ask me a question, just to tease out this is something that's happening in their organization, and they just want to figure out what's the next best step. Reach out to me on my website, questei.org. The name of my company is Quest Employment Initiatives. Definitely. Just reach out to me. You can book some time on my calendar, and I'd be happy to carve out some time to have a conversation with you. If you are interested in actually booking me to speak about the work that I've done regarding the top 10 indicators of a broken workplace culture and how to fix them, you can go to my speaking website, which is natalieholderspeaks.com.
excellent. I'll be sure to highlight those websites for our listeners. And Natalie, I have to say that this has been an incredible conversation. I personally have learned a lot, very insightful, incredibly timely, and I realize this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I can't wait to have you back because there's so much more that we have to dive into. But from your work in employment law to your leadership in shaping workplace culture and your powerful message in exclusion, you're helping organizations not only avoid risk, but actually thrive. And Natalie, I really have to thank you for sharing your knowledge and joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sal. I really appreciated our conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Top Attorneys podcast. The Top Attorneys celebrates the achievements of leading attorneys across the nation. To be featured, send a message or visit www.topattorneys.us.